twisted and fascinating stories from Manchester's most notorious crooks in the 1800s. In this video, we'll be exploring the seedy underbelly of Victorian Manchester's criminal underworld. We'll be taking a look at some fascinating mugshots and case files from the Greater Manchester Police Archives, giving you a glimpse into the rogues and villains that stalked the streets from the 1870s up until World War I. If you were able to take a glimpse at the Greater Manchester Police Archives, you would discover case files about shady individual characters accompanied by fascinating mugshots that tells the stories of the criminals. From Salford gangsters to prolific thieves, the Greater Manchester Police Archive and Museum collection makes for incredible viewing. The images date as early as the 1870s to the breakout of the First World War, and those include individuals that have committed such crimes as cheese stealers, fraudsters, burglars, terrorists, and even a corrupt American politician on the run, with a $10,000 reward up for grabs. Carefully handwritten notes accompany the mugshots with in-depth details of each individual in the mugshots. What's more, these mugshots reveal how little has changed over the course of the mugshot's long history, which dates back almost as far as the beginning of photography itself. During the 1840s, when it was still a new technology, police departments displayed daguerreotype portraits of potential rogues or suspects. The nature of long exposure photography meant that often several people needed to hold down the suspects in order to get the photo. The department then displayed the likenesses so that the patrolmen could familiarize themselves with the suspects. The first criminal to be discussed is William Brooks. The young 20-year-old man was arrested in 1890, although it is unclear what his exact crime were. He was part of a gang called the Scuttlers, who plagued the streets of Manchester and Salford at the end of the 19th century. Scuttlers existed as one of England's first youth cults, making their mark in history years before Birmingham's Peaky Blinders entered the scene. Identifiable by their distinctive uniform of peaked caps, long fringes, silk scarves and brass-tipped shoes, Scuttler gangs quickly rose to prominence and infamy amongst those who lived in the slums and industrial areas of Victorian Manchester and surrounding areas. The term Scuttler is used as an umbrella term for the youth gangs that would claim territories around the city. Two of the most prominent scuttling gangs were the Bengal Tigers, who derived their name from Bengal Street, and the Prussia Street Lads, most of whom lived in and around Prussia Street. The best way to identify a Scuttler gang member was from the clothing they wore. Men wore peaked caps, long fringes, silk scarves and brass-tipped shoes, while women wore patterned skirts to signify their allegiance to various gangs. For instance, girls associated with the Salford Hope Street mob would wear skirts with vertical stripes. They were made up of young men and women, usually of the ages 14, 18, and even 19. They carried weapons, such as belts, knives and guns. The act of scuttling itself relates to the battles, or scuttles, between rival gangs. These conflicts were highly organized, and would frequently take place by appointment. The battles were used by the youths as a means of proving themselves against their peers. Next we have Herbert Grosvenor, who took to petty crimes, such as breaking into homes, though apart from his crimes, not much is known about him. Herbert was taken into custody in June 1930. He was convicted of 3 counts of housebreaking and caged. He had been in court 4 years earlier and fined 5 shillings for having a dog without a license. Here we have Murphy, who had to be assisted to have his mugshot taken, as he wasn't pleased with having his photo taken. He was convicted of a variety of crimes, such as chiefly stealing purses, by courts in Yorkshire and Lancashire in the 1880s and 1890s. Murphy tried to lie about his age, stating to the police he was 65 years old. But police said he looked younger. The police described him as being nearly completely bald, and he had poor oral hygiene, which wasn't uncommon for poorer classes. During the 1800s, Margaret Carrigan is the first female criminal on our list, and was under the alias Marion Cowell. Carrigan was a career thief, and made regular appearances in the dock in the early 1900s. She first came to the attention of the Manchester City Police in 1902, when she was sentenced to 3 months hard labour for the theft of a purse containing £7, 10 south. A year later, she was back before the court for the theft of £2, 9 south. Curiously, given the relatively small amount stolen on this occasion, she received the same sentence of 3 months hard labour. She reappears in the Manchester police records in 1908 and was convicted of 3 offences of theft of clothing. For each of these offences, she's sentenced to 3 months imprisonment, and the sentences to be served consecutively. Her final appearance in the records was when she got arrested on the 18th of December 1911. She was convicted of theft of a dress and pairs of boys' knickers, and again receives her usual 3-month sentence. She was sent to prison on the 22nd of December 1911. James Johnson was into an unusual type of theft, and was arrested on February 8, 1911. He was 50 years old at the time of his crime, and a labourer. His unusual crime was stealing stockings, and he was charged on 3 offences. He was sentenced to 3 months with hard labour later that same month. His luck remained bad when he was sentenced to a total of 3 months with hard labour on the 15th of the same month. This appeared to have been his only appearance on police records, so perhaps his life had improved. William Ingham was one of Victorian Manchester's most persistent, if not successful, serial offenders, operating under a range of aliases including Johnson, Evans, Aspinall, Higgins and Jackson. He became very well acquainted with Manchester City Police. Born in London in the 1840s, he first came to the attention of the force in 1865 when arrested for stealing a watch. He was sentenced to 3 months imprisonment with hard labour for the offence on the 3rd of June that year. His criminal career continued as he committed burglary, theft, office breaking and handling counterfeit currency, amongst other offences, over the next 45 years. Ingham was convicted a total of 18 times and sentenced to nearly 29 years in prison. He disappears from police records after this time, so perhaps a hard life and hard times finally took their toll. It seems the most obvious conclusion to his story, as such a determined man seems unlikely to have given up his chosen career such a late stage. John Richardson's crime was one of false identity, as he tried to pose as a railway engineer. The face of John Richardson that peers from the pages of early Manchester City Police intelligence ledger appears to be uncertain and unsure. He was most probably hauled in for train fare dodging. However, it appeared that the image from the police records may have been misleading. According to the ledger entry, which unfortunately had no date, John had recently caused a sensation by posing as a railway engineer and travelling extensively on the London and North Western Railways network. In the records they said he was well known to Leeds police in the same report. The ledger gives little details of his criminal career, but the fact that he appears suggests that officers in Manchester at the time had an inkling that he was up to no good. Mary Elizabeth Smith was only 19 years old when she was arrested in 1893. The extravagant hat Mary was wearing at the time of her arrest made her look more like she's going to a wedding than to do time in prison. But don't let this young woman fool you, as you see she had a long list of offences, which included larceny, obtaining money under false presences, and more strangely wearing apparel. Mary was seen in and out of custody several times in the early 1890s. Perhaps the extravagant hat formed part of the evidence for her last offence, Mary Bates, or under her alias Haywood. Birchall or Solway was in the Manchester police records under the ledger as a notorious thief, and was well known to local officers and operating in the area. Intelligence ledgers allowed officers to share information about active criminals, their methods and appearance. In the case of Mary, it appears her usual criminal method was to gain employment as a domestic servant, and when the right opportunity came about, she would take her employer's valuables and make a run for it. Patrick Cox was a 39-year-old sailor and operated a potentially lucrative sideline as a coiner in Victorian Manchester. Patrick was arrested in 1893 for coining. Coining was the practice of clipping precious metal from the edge of coins, or reproducing coins in their entirety, but from base metal. Forgers were taking a huge risk. Punishments for counterfeiting ranged from hard labor to transportation. Although the crime did cease to carry the death penalty in 1832, to prevent the practice of coining, currency was designed to be difficult to reproduce or interfere with. If you look around the edge of a modern English pound coin, you will notice the words Decacet Tamen engraved into the rippled edge. The term means an ornament and safeguard, and its origins date back to the Stuart era. The information about Cox's crimes is sparse in this early Manchester City Police intelligence ledger. There's very little information on Cox, but he was born in Manchester, had a sallow complexion, and amongst other features including 6 moles on his left arm, but also a nickname under Paddy the Devil. He was clearly no saint. He may well have been a lucky man, and only been sent to prison. Had he been operating a century or earlier, it is likely he would have received the death penalty. Leon Lampoon was a cultured-looking individual who fell foul of the law in 1878. Leon Lampoon was convicted of fraud at Manchester Assizes in July of that year and sentenced to 15 months imprisonment. Unfortunately, the details of his offence are unclear, but he merited a mention in this early police intelligence ledger. However, Leon certainly appeared to be a man who liked to dress well, and perhaps expensive tastes led to his downfall, or even his main motivation for fraud. Eliza Wright was 23 years old, and stood just 5 feet tall. She was recorded having brown hair, hazel eyes, and a fresh complexion. The records also showed that she was married, and a resident of Reddish, Stockport. She was arrested on December 17, 1909, for 3 counts of false pretenses, using deception to get money or goods. She seems to have gone to some trouble to dress well for her court appearance, perhaps in the hope that it would influence the verdict, or the severity of any punishment she might receive. However, in fact, she was sentenced to 3 months imprisonment on each charge, but the sentences are shown as being concurrent, meaning they would all be served simultaneously, and she would have been released on the 17th of March, 1910. From the records, it is not known if she regarded this as harsh or a lucky escape, but she would have to spend the Christmas and New Year holidays of 1909 behind bars. Catherine Day was born in County Mayo, Ireland, in 1845, and was a resident of Rochelle at the time of her arrest. Catherine Day was described as being 5 feet 1 in height, having blue eyes, grey hair, a fresh complexion, and her profession was a midwife. She made only 1 appearance in the records of the Rochelle Borough Police, when she was convicted of frequenting and sentenced to 1 month in prison in 1895, in full. The offence is frequenting the highway with intent to commit a felony, and it appears fairly frequently in the police records of the time. Once an offender had a number of convictions to their name, officers could arrest the individual, as they believed they were acting in a suspicious manner. What prior transgressions had placed her in this position is unrecorded, and the fact that she has no previous convictions noted in the Rochelle files would suggest that she had committed her previous offences in other towns. This suggests she liked to travel to other local towns, where she might have been less well known to commit her crimes, or she had only recently arrived in the area, but the local force had been notified of her record. After this offence, she does not appear again in records, and this could have been due to her changing her ways or just simply moved on to commit crimes elsewhere. William Roberts was also known under the aliases Brooks, Brown, Wild, and Davies, and first came to the attention of Manchester City Police in October 1856. Between that date and December 1861, he was sentenced to prison terms for stealing, in turn, Saturn, money, and a watch. His criminal and prison career continued around Manchester and Knutsford, Cheshire, for the next decade, until he was sentenced to 7 years in 1873 for the theft of another watch. Unfortunately, doing time behind bars did not deter him from going on to commit more crimes upon his release, and he is last reported as being sentenced to 3 months for theft in 1883. Next, we have an interesting twist about two criminals who worked together to steal coal. Richard Hyam was a 40-year-old collier, and William Haskell was a 33-year-old carter at the time of their crime in Bolton in 1920. Both appeared in court in Bolton, charged with stealing coal on February 26 that same year. Both men are said to have brown hair and brown eyes, and are 5 feet 9 inches and 5 feet 5 inches respectively. They were also both recorded as natives of Westhampton. The records don't state any further information about the nature of their crimes, but their punishment may shed some light on the scale of their enterprise. Similar offences in the Book of Thieves are punished with small fines, so the criminal duo had to pay a fine of up to £20 each, which was a hefty fine in those days for the working class. However much coal they may have stolen, it ended up costing them dearly. Edith Towell was a domestic servant with a hidden side hustle of being a petty thief, and she repeatedly came to the attention of the police during the last years of the 19th century. She was born in Leamington, but was a resident of Rochelle at the time of her crimes. Edith first appears in police records when convicted of stealing wearing apparel on the 28th of September 1889, and was fined 40 shillings by the local magistrate. But it doesn't seem to have been a deterrent for Edith, as she was soon back in court in Liverpool only days later, when sentenced to 3 months for stealing a gold watch and £4 3 South 4D. Edith seemed to have taken a small break from her criminal activity, or at least her appearances before the court, as she does not appear in records again until 1895. This time, she's convicted of stealing £7 in cash and £40 in cooperative store checks in, where else but the town synonymous with the cooperative movement, Rochelle. Her story becomes confused at this point, but in 1895, she appears to have served prison sentences in both Coventry and Worcester before making her final appearance on police files after being sentenced at Salford Sessions to 3 months for stealing wearing apparel and a watch in 1897. After this time, she wasn't seen in police records again, and had seemed to quit her petty theft habits. From records, her date of birth seemed to have been unknown, but it was said she had been 36 years old in 1895. Thomas Wallace was a man with a prolific criminal career spanning 3 decades during the 1800s, and first appears on record when he was sentenced to a month's imprisonment for larceny in 1856. Upon his release, Thomas' taste for crime was too great, and he offended again almost immediately. This time, he was sentenced to 3 months for a similar crime. This seems to have set a pattern of behavior that continued for many years, and Thomas would be imprisoned and released repeatedly, only to be back before a judge in a matter of weeks. The situation took a more dramatic turn in 1871. On the 10th of April that year, he was sentenced to 7 years penal servitude for stealing cloth, and he began his sentence in Leeds prison. But on May 29th, he escaped and went on the run, though it wasn't stated in records how he had managed to escape. Thomas next appeared in court in December the same year, and was sentenced to 7 years for receiving stolen goods. Curiously, the previous sentence and the escape from prison went unmentioned at this point. He was sentenced to 12 months in 1881 for escaping from prison, but whether this refers to his earlier escape is unclear. In November 1882, when he had just been sentenced to 10 years penal servitude for another offence of receiving stolen goods, it was his last appearance in police records. Henry Norton was 38 years old when he was arrested in 1897. He must have been a very important prisoner indeed, as in 1887, Manchester City Police dispatched their greatest detective, Jerome Canada, to arrest him at Dover in Kent, Canada, often described as the Manchester Sherlock Holmes, was one of the most famous detectives of his era. He joined the Manchester City Police in 1872, and his prolific arrest rate saw him rise through the ranks. He retired in 1899 with the rank of Detective Superintendent as the first head of the Manchester Detective Division. After retirement from the police service, he worked as a private detective and an estate agent, also becoming the counsellor for Openshaw. Canada died at his Moorside home 1914. He remains perhaps Manchester's most famous detective, and was a true Colossus of his age. After Henry was arrested by Canada for embezzling several £1,000s belonging to the Cheshire Lines Committee railway line, he was sentenced to 9 months behind bars in 1897. Not much is known about Henry, as after this police record, there were no more reappearances from him. James Such was only 19 years old at the time of his arrest in 1920. James had been fined £3.15 at court in Bolton for his crime of stealing a bicycle. Records show that in 1917, he was bound over for 12 months for the same offence. In between, he had been fined tens for the offence of gaming. There are no further records relating to James. Possibly he changed his ways, and didn't further trouble the courts on minor crimes. William Lewis was another well-known person of interest to the Manchester City Police in the early 1900s. William was noted in the records to have been an excellent office breaker, and a clever housebreaker. Unlike many of the other contemporaries in the ledger, William's entry does not contain information on a string of convictions. Maybe he was clever enough to evade arrest. Alexander Thompson was 55 years old at the time of his arrest in 1898, and was a lithographer by trade. He may have had a look of an aging gunfighter who had made his way out to the Wild West, but in fact, Alexander was Glaswegian, who made his way south to Rochelle. His occupation may have been part of his problem, as many of his convictions were for forgery and fraud, as he had been to prison 11 times for various crimes. He seems to have had a change of plan in 1898, as he was sentenced to 3 months for larceny. William M. Tweed wasn't originally from Manchester. Neither was he from the UK altogether, as he was a wanted criminal in America. $10,000 may seem to have been a huge reward for William, but he was an escaped prisoner in the 1870s, and he was no small fish of a prisoner either. He was alleged to have stolen between $25 and an amazing $400 million from the taxpayers of New York City via various corrupt methods. William was a prominent local politician and former member of the United States House of Representatives, and was known to most people as Boss Tweed. He was said to have used his political influence to extract money from the city over many years. Before the nature of his activities began to surface in the early 1870s, after various trials and time spent behind bars, he fled to Spain. While on a home visit from prison in 1875, he was still embroiled in legal cases. The Spanish excursion proved short-lived, and he was returned to New York, where he died in prison in 1878. He was 55, around 5 feet 11 of portly build, of ruddy complexion, and had a large, prominent nose. Manchester City Police intelligence had him on records, even though Tweed's escape took him to other shores, and he never entered the UK, let alone Manchester. But it seems that Manchester officers were keeping a keen eye out for him at the time of his escape. Ernest Ward was 32 years old, and a Stockport-based pork butcher at the time of his arrest, and had already come to the attention of the local police on many occasions, having 5 previous convictions for larceny and 4 for assault. It seems unlikely this was the first time he had faced imprisonment. Ernest was arrested on the 27th of October in 1911, and unlike other urinals who would have a sad, angry or neutral expression, Ernest had a large smiling expression upon his arrest, and seemed amused by the situation he was in. Upon his arrest, he had been sentenced to 6 months with hard labor for stealing jewelry in the town. After this, records doesn't show that Ernest appeared again, and there were no further mentions of him. So perhaps he reformed his ways after he was released on this occasion. Richard Hurst was 19 years old at the time of his crime, and was a cinematography operator from Salford. He was sentenced at Stockport on the 7th of July and ended up serving 3 months in prison for the offence of false presences, what we would today call deception. He was no stranger to the offence, having been found guilty of the crime on 3 previous occasions over the previous 13 months. His previous convictions took place in Lancaster, Bury and Reinstall. After this he disappears from our records. Perhaps he changed his ways and joined the armed services on release. If so, like so many others, he may not have returned home. Clara Pendlebury was 32 years old, and she was employed as a cardroom hand in the cotton spinning industry. Clara made an appearance in Bolton Borough Police's Book of Convicted Criminals, known as the Thieves' Book, in 1918. She was described as having dark brown hair, grey eyes, and being of sallow complexion. The record also states she stood 4 feet 10 inches tall, and was a native of Hindley. On the 8th of April, she was convicted of stealing 2.5 pounds lbs of raw cotton, and was fined 40 shillings for the offence. No further information can be traced of Clara, so it is to assume that after this offence Clara never committed any sort of crime again. Lastly, we have Albert Haycock, who was a 21-year-old man at the time of his arrest in 1907, and he was from Heaton Mersey in Stockport. Albert was convicted of 2 counts of stealing iron on the 27th of November that year. Metal theft seems to have always been an issue. Even today, the news will report of metal theft and the practice of stealing metal to seem to date back quite far back. Albert was sentenced to 12 days imprisonment with hard labour for each offence, and this sentence seems to have made a lasting impression on him. He doesn't seem to make any further appearance in the police records. These criminals all had unique crimes and interesting backgrounds that time had simply forgot. However, thanks to Duncan Brawley, who is a curator of the Greater Manchester Police Archive and Museum since it opened in 1981, and his team have had the fascinating job of trawling through the records and reading each intriguing tale. The museum take care of these records so that future generations can learn about the long-standing history of police work, but also of the crimes that took place. The photos of all the individuals featured in this video were stored in police intelligence ledgers after an arrest, so they could be shared with officers from neighbouring areas at the time. We now conclude our video on the twisted and fascinating stories from Manchester's most notorious crooks in the 1800s. If you enjoyed the video and love historic tale that time have forgotten, please feel free to like, subscribe and hit the bell icon to keep in the loop when the next video drops.